Anselm makes two important contributions. First has to do with these philosophical proofs for the existence of God. One of the major developments of Anselm is what's known as the ontological proof. So for Anselm, thinking about God, right, when we think about God, we are thinking about that which nothing higher can be thought. Right, so the highest thing we can possibly think about is what we're thinking about when we think about God. So he starts with this base proposition. We conceive of God as a being that which no greater can be conceived. So what he means by God is that he is the greatest being conceived. We cannot conceive of a being greater than God, because God is the being of which no greater can be conceived. Now, having thought of that, we need to recognize that this being could either actually exist in reality or could exist solely in the mind. All right, so it exists either in the mind alone or both in the mind and in reality. So how do we determine then whether this being is simply a product of mind or actually exists? Well, says Anselm, let's start off by thinking about God simply being a concept that is invented in the mind. But if that's true, that doesn't mean we're thinking about God, because actually existing is greater than existing in the mind alone. And since God is defined as that being of which no greater can be conceived, then if God only exists in the mind, we can conceive of a greater being than God, because God would have to actually exist. So, since this being can be conceived of existing really, then to solely exist in the mind is not to be God. Therefore, this being than which no greater can be conceived must exist in reality as well as exist in the mind. Now, again, I don't know that this is entirely persuasive, but you can see how he's reasoning here. There certainly was, it wasn't accepted as without controversy. I always find the ontological proof as not that great of a proof for the existence of God from the standpoint of philosophy, because it seems like it's missing some places where you absolutely get an agreement on. And even at the time, there were controversies. And so it's not just been after Anselm. A monk at the time said, well, I can think of the most beautiful island, but that doesn't mean it exists. To which Anselm responded, well, there's a difference between an object and its existence. All right? So we have an island, and whether an island exists or not. But when we're talking about God, we are talking about being itself. Right? The totality of being, what it means to be being, is what we're talking about with God. So, essentially we're talking about being, not being, if we talk about being, not existing. Follow me on that? No, I don't follow me on that. But essentially, he's trying to say we're talking about the principle of being versus I can think of something really, really cool, that doesn't mean existence. And so Anselm's saying to try and use that as an argument against the ontological argument is not what Anselm's talking about. On one hand, it seems like this is just logical wrangling about words. It doesn't seem like it actually has any substance. But for Anselm and others at the time, it seemed to be pretty important. In fact, the ontological argument is very important for Descartes and his emphasis on rationalism in the 1600s. And Descartes' famous statement, "I think, therefore I am." So Descartes kind of takes this position of, I'm going to doubt the existence of everything until I can be determined that something actually exists. Well, since I am the one doubting, I must exist for there to be someone or something to doubt. So I think, therefore I am.
That's kind of like the logic. I can't be crazy because I'm all crazy.
It's getting there almost, right? If you're going to be skeptical of everything, well, there has to be someone skeptical who's being skeptical. So you must exist to be skeptical of your existence. And because if you were unable to be skeptical of your existence, when he moves from I think, therefore I am, to try and use the ontological argument to prove the existence of God. That's the part that doesn't come out as much. We probably have heard, I think, therefore I am, but it's Descartes' then movement into the ontological argument that comes out of that. But essentially what I'm trying to show here is this effort in the later Middle Ages to try and use philosophy and reason to prove statements of faith. It becomes very difficult, of course, to try and prove the existence of God through philosophy, at least to a skeptic. Because while many Christians would find comfort in the belief of the universe exhibits design, so there must be a designer, a lot of skeptics would argue, well, the universe doesn't exhibit design. And so you have a greater problem with trying to suggest design exists before you could even posit a designer. So philosophical arguments like this may or may not be significantly reasonable, but they do demonstrate how people are trying to address issues of faith through philosophy and theology rather than necessarily through revelation. The other major developments coming out of Anselm has to do with interpretations of Christ's death. What we're talking about here is the atonement. How does the atonement work? Why is it, and how is it, that Christ's death deals with the sinfulness of humanity? Now, throughout the centuries and throughout, especially the Middle Ages, there were a variety of approaches to discussing how the atonement worked. One approach was known as the Christus Victor approach. Essentially, that the crucifixion and the resurrection was Christ's victory over sin, death, and Satan. And so that's what happened, was Christ was victorious, and that deals with sin. Connected with that was what was often referred to as the harrowing of hell. That between Christ's death and his resurrection, he descended into hell and frees the people who were trapped there, based on an interpretation of 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 18 and following. The idea of Jesus preaching to the spirits in prison. Another popular idea of the atonement was the ransom theory of atonement. Essentially, the idea was that because of sin, the devil had certain rights over humanity. And in order to relinquish those rights, he had to be paid. And so Christ's death pays what is owed for the release of humanity being held captive by the devil. Right? Like a ransom is paid to a kidnapper. Then there was what's sometimes referred to as the mousetrap or fishhook theory of the atonement. Very interesting one to me. I find it very intriguing. I don't know that it's very scriptural. But essentially the idea was that Christ comes as a human being, right? Jesus of Nazareth. Satan, not recognizing who he is, chooses Jesus to be essentially the sacrifice for humanity. Recognizing his humanity, not recognizing his divinity, and so in the crucifixion, Satan is caught in the mousetrap. He's caught by the fishhook of Jesus' divinity. Right? And so it's kind of like God fooled Satan into choosing Jesus as, right, this is the man that everything's going to hang on. Right? And if this man can take care of sin, it's going to take care of sin. Right? So his humanity is the bait, his divinity is the trap, and Satan is caught by trying to take Jesus' flesh, only to realize that he is God in human form. Again, I don't know we can push that very far scripturally, but it is kind of an interesting little, idea. Anselm's attempt is more of an idea, what we may call the satisfaction theory of atonement. And this is written about in his work, Cur Deus Homo, or Why Did God Become Man? Again, like everything else, right, he's trying to rationally prove the need for the incarnation. So essentially for Anselm, there's a rational necessity for every Christian truth. It must be true, must be logically true. So for Anselm, God created humanity in righteousness with the goal that he is going to provide them eternal blessedness. He's going to provide us eternal happiness. And that's why he creates us. Now, that happiness, that blessedness, is dependent upon our obedience. If we obey God, then we receive those blessings. However, when Adam and Eve disobey, when humanity disobeys in Adam and Eve, and so believing in original sin, that frustrates God's purpose. But ultimately, and some argues, God's purpose cannot be frustrated. So there must be some sort of remedy. There must be some sort of satisfaction made for sin. The offense must be purged. However, because it is a sin against God, the sin is of eternal or infinite significance. So it is not something simple. There is, however, a problem. Sin is of infinite significance, and only something infinitely significant can take away sin. Humanity doesn't have the ability, doesn't have the resources to provide satisfaction. So we have the obligation, humanity does, the entirety of humanity. We lack the resources to satisfy sin. So we have the obligation but not the resources. God has the resources, but he doesn't have the obligation. And God is not obliged to pay for sin since he has not sinned. But a God-man would have both the ability to take away sin and the obligation as a human being to provide satisfaction. So, for Anselm, the incarnation is fitting, rationally fitting. It must take place. God must choose. When God chooses, God must choose the best of all possible choices. And since He chose the incarnation and the crucifixion, they must be the best choices. They must be necessarily more reasonable. Because if there was another reasonable approach to deal with satisfaction, God would have chosen that approach rather than the incarnation. So, therefore, the incarnation must be the best choice. For Augustine, thinking back to some of those ideas we talked about during his time, right? As we sin, we destroyed our wills. And so it's impossible to not sin for Augustine. For Anselm, it's more about lacking the resources to pay for our sins, no matter how much we want to. So we owe more than we took. And so, because of this, and because that Christ didn't need to die, in the sense that He didn't need to die because He didn't sin, His death presented an infinite reward. And so that's where this all fits in. Additionally, there's some legal theory here as well, in that Anselm believes that Christ creates this infinite reward by dying when He did not need to. And then He wills that. We talked about the New Testament. Testament, in other words, for will. Right? So Christ wills that to humanity in order to redeem them. So that's how we benefit from His death. Again, when we look at it, we say, well, I don't know if all of that is necessarily scriptural. Well, you see what he's trying to do is trying to make an appeal to God becoming human is a rational idea, not just something you would have to take on faith. Questions, comments, cries of disbelief. For a while, right, the satisfaction theory of atonement is pretty popular. It's still pretty popular in some ways, not necessarily this, but the idea of wrath being satisfied, right? That shows up in Christ alone. We've seen that in chapel. The wrath of God was satisfied. There are other songs where we sing about this satisfaction notion of the atonement. So that idea that there's something that must be satisfied becomes a popular one, even if we don't necessarily think of it in these specific ways. Another important scholastic during the times was a man named Peter Abelard. Now, Abelard was born in the city of La Palais in the region of Brittany in France. His father left his family to go on the Crusades. Peter stays at home and studies. He's not particularly a likable guy. He's very intelligent. He becomes unsatisfied with his teachers, becomes unsatisfied with a lot of previous Christian thinkers, ends up making a lot of enemies because of it. Eventually goes to Paris to serve as a priest. He begins teaching without much qualification. It's basically because of his intellect. And eventually ends up heading the school of Notre Dame in Paris. Notre Dame, the French for Our Lady, specifically referring to Mary. So Notre Dame is related to Mary. Peter has a rather high opinion of himself, particularly because with his other teachers, he's bested them in debate and kind of feels himself really unbeatable when it comes to logic and philosophy. However, it's not logic or philosophy that ends up getting him into the most trouble. While in Notre Dame, he's entrusted with training the niece of another priest, a woman named Heloise. and he falls in love with her. Eventually, she gets pregnant. Heloise is essentially Abelard's equal, very intelligent, very accomplished academically, knows several languages, but this pregnancy is going to be a challenge for both of them. They decide they would get married secretly. Although apparently, from some of the things that remain from this time, apparently Heloise would have been content with being Abelard's mistress and him continuing to be a priest instead of them actually getting married and him being unable to continue as a priest. Eventually their affair is discovered. Heloise's uncle has Peter attacked and castrated. Eventually, with this, because of it, he decides to become a monk and convinces Heloise to become a nun. Their son is named astrolabe, after the scientific instrument used to determine positions of stars. And he pretty much disappears from the historical record. There's not much known about him. Abelard will write quite a bit, and he writes some advice to him some years later, but it's unclear how old the son is. It doesn't appear like they had much interaction. Heloise and Abelard will correspond. There's about 7 letters that are considered to be authentic that occur between the two of them in their respective monastic houses, but they never mention astrolabe. And so we don't. There's a death date recorded for him, but not a year. So not much else is known about him.